Good afternoon, everybody. It's my privilege to introduce Dr. Zachary Burt, who is going to present his talk today. He is currently a visiting research fellow with the Columbia Global Centers in Mumbai and at IIT Mumbai on a Fulbright Nehru Scholarship. At Columbia University, Dr. Burt is researching efficient, effective, and equitable ways of incorporating climate risk into urban water policy. He's conducted field research in India and also in Tanzania, Kenya, Morocco, and has worked around water policies in California, India, and Kenya. He's researched the costs and benefits of urban water service improvements, some very interesting work which he's going to mention briefly in today's talk as well, around the 24/7 water supply projects in Hubli Dharwad. Today, however, he's going to focus on his more recent work on sanitation and sanitation access, also some of it drawing on field work from Hubli and Dharwad. He earned his PhD at the Energy and Resources Group at the University of California in Berkeley. Briefly about his talk, he is going to talk about access to sanitation globally and will discuss the human right to water in context of Sustainable Development Goal number 6. Thinking critically about the definitions used for the terms safe, accessible, affordable, and equitable, he will review the progress in the last 2 decades in India and globally when it comes to access to sanitation. He's going to, as I mentioned, he's going to draw on some of his work on, the impacts on equity of upgrades in sanitation in Hubli Dharwad. And he'll explore what are the major sources of contamination from fecal waste, who are exposed using his own modified version of the ship flow diagram, and will then explore different options for waste treatment, reuse, and disposal, and the challenges of sustainable liquid waste management in Hubli Dharwad. So over to Dr. Zachary Burt.
Can you hear me? Yeah. So thank you so much for having me here today. It's really a pleasure to present to CPR. I actually presented here in January of 2017. I don't know if anyone was able to attend at that time. But I presented some preliminary research ideas at that time, and I got really outstanding feedback. That feedback, along with some other feedback from local collaborators on the ground, led me to go in new directions of research. And so I hope that it's okay. I was planning on today presenting much more preliminary work right now in order to try and get feedback from all of you to see if this is a fruitful direction to go in. So most of what I'm going to be talking about today is not the end results of a project. It's more the framework of what we're trying to implement, and then some more qualitative observations, which we're trying to turn into quantitative results. So I would love to hear your comments, your ideas, if you think that's something we should go in a different direction, or if you think that we're going in the right direction, please feel free to say.
So just to clarify, he is going to present for around 45 minutes, and then for the rest of the time, that's until 5:30, we will have an open discussion when we can ask questions specifically about what is presented, and also feedback and people's ideas based on the work that you've been doing. He's very interested in hearing that as well. So we'll take that in the discussion.
Yes, definitely. So part of the reason for coming to CPR is that I also want to learn more about what's happening right now, beyond whatever documents I've been able to glean from your website. So please tell me more about your own research as well. In addition to this presentation, it sounds like there might be some interest to hear about the work that I previously did on the drinking water system in Hubli Dharwad. That's an impact evaluation of the continuous water pilot project there, the 24/7 pilot project there. So that is in a different presentation, but if there's time, I'll just pull up a few of those slides and talk about that as well, if there's interest. It sounded like there might be, so. So I want to talk about access, and when I talk about access, I'm going to be pulling a lot from the SDGs. I'll go through this section pretty quickly, since this is obviously going to be a review from everyone in this room. But just to make sure that we have a baseline common language that we're all using, and also as an argument that for the other two projects that I'm going to be presenting, they're sort of a reaction against only focusing on access and trying to expand beyond that. So it's good to talk about access in the beginning in order to set up the other projects as sort of a response to that. The other two projects, one is looking at inequity in the sanitation system, and the other one is looking at sustainable sanitation and sort of how are we going to get to a more upgraded system. So that's specifically looking at preferences and willingness to pay. Just so that you all know my perspective and where I'm coming from, I put up this larger motivational question. This is how I think about my research, broadly speaking, is I try and design my research questions to go towards this larger motivational question of how can we expand human capabilities and maintain healthy ecosystems equitably, efficiently, and sustainably. And I think about water and sanitation through three different lenses: water as essential to healthy ecosystems, water as a human right, and water as an economic good. And in my own work, I found that it's very important to think about water in all three of these different ways at the same time. Because I've found that there's this, I wouldn't even say trade-off, I would just say relationship. And depending on the context, depending on the problem, depending on the solution, there may be a trade-off between two or more of these different understandings of water, but there also might be possible solutions that find a complement between them. So I think it's just always important to keep all three in mind and look for what is the relationship between them. Now, keeping these three different lenses, these three different understandings in mind, just very quickly as I go through the SDGs, I'm going to pull up very specific terminology that I want everyone to keep in mind, and I'm going to categorize those terms in these three different lenses. So those terms are accessible, safe, and clean, which I think is most closely associated with the human right to water. Sustainable and efficient, which are ideas that I think are most closely associated with water as being essential for healthy ecosystems. And then affordable and equitable, which I think are most closely associated with water as an economic good. Now, I'm sure everyone is familiar with SDG 6 and also with the targets and the indicators that have been adopted for SDG 6. In particular, I'm just going to be looking at SDG 6.2 today, again, very quickly. And in SDG 6.2, this excerpt that I put up here, again, includes these terms of access and equitable, which I think are important to keep in mind as we analyze, okay, what is the SDG telling us, and is it an incomplete picture? So looking at the sanitation ladder, just going very quickly because I'm sure everyone here is familiar with open defecation, unimproved sanitation, meaning that it doesn't include a squat plate, limited sanitation, meaning that it includes a squat plate or it's pour flush, but it's shared, and then basic, meaning that it's not shared, it's only used by one household, and then above that, safely managed, meaning that you've looked at, you've installed some sort of effective treatment mechanism for the waste. So then looking at different regions in the world, we can see that there's been big improvements in general. In particular, the largest improvements between 2000 and 2015 were seen in South Asia. There's still a ways to go in both South Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa. Interestingly, in Sub-Saharan Africa, although the majority of households do have access to some form of sanitation, there is still a big chunk that are accessing unimproved sanitation. So these are pit latrines without a squat plate. Focusing on India and breaking it out into rural and urban areas, we can see that there's, again, no big news here. I'm sure everyone is familiar. A big discrepancy between rural and urban. So there's a real problem with equity, I think, when we make this comparison. But even within cities, you can see that there is open defecation happening at a much larger rate in smaller cities as compared to large cities. And there's still this question about, okay, even if you build it, which is what this Swachh Bharat mission, SBM, that's the dark green bars. Even if you build it, it doesn't necessarily mean that people are going to use it. So you can see that the SBM bars, at least for 2012 and 2014, are slightly higher than the JMP estimates. But I think it's important to go beyond access and also look at equity in the whole system. How do we do that? I think there's been a lot of work, qualitative work, looking at equity in sanitation systems, but we're trying to quantify some of that in our current projects. So in order to do that, we want to create some sort of a modified shit flow diagram. Now, a shit flow diagram, or SFD, is based on this idea of the sanitation service chain. So a sanitation service chain includes capture, containment, emptying and transport, treatment, and then safe reuse or disposal. This can be applied to non-sewered sanitation as well as sewered sanitation. In sewered sanitation, containment and then emptying and transport would just be one stage of transport in the sewer. Now, if we look at, if we first categorize, is everyone here is familiar with SFDs, right? Yeah, okay. All right, so then I won't go into this so much. SFDs are really great because they're easy to make. They're a good starting point for policy design and debate. And they're a visual diagram that makes it easy to identify sanitation gaps. But they focus on material flow. They focus on access, and then they focus on material flow. They don't focus on who are exposed. They don't focus on who is it that has access and doesn't have access. So some examples of this is who benefits from subsidized cost of a UGD and who's not benefiting from that subsidy. Who is burdened at the end of the drain? And by burden, I don't just mean who is living right next to the outfall. I'm also talking about who is living next to these open drains that sometimes get clogged with solid waste and then end up in some sort of flooding that either of the roadside or even into people's houses. Who's using groundwater? So if we're talking about on-site sanitation, a lot of on-site sanitation systems are inadequately protecting groundwater supplies. Who's using that groundwater? And for the people that are using that groundwater, who's actually treating it before they drink it? So I think these are the kinds of things that we want to look at through some sort of a visual diagram that will either be a modified SFD or something similar that gets at these questions of who has access, who doesn't, who is exposed, and who's not. In order to do this, we're trying to collect data both in Aleppi as well as Hubli Dharwad. In Aleppi, we're collaborating with IIT Bombay, and in Hubli Dharwad, we're collaborating with CMDR. The goal is to highlight social inequities, economic externalities, and issues of environmental justice in the sanitation system upgrades. And the objective is to create a modified shit flow diagram where we can segregate the sanitation value chain into socioeconomic categories, either wealth or possibly caste and religion. So just to give a rough example of what this might look like, again, we're playing around with how we might design these things. But if we can at least give some sort of category, and this example, I'm giving wealth categories. This is not based on actual data. This is just an example. If we can break down who has access to the sewer and then who has access to on-site sanitation into wealth categories, and then also break down who is being exposed in the end, as well as during transport, then I think we can start to see what the current state of inequity is. And if we do this sort of modified SFD before some sort of an upgrade is implemented, and then again after, we can see if this inequity has been increased or decreased. So this is the idea, is that we want to build some sort of a easy to understand visual tool that will do a rough estimate of what the impacts of inequity might be from sanitation system upgrades. In addition, this particular study is also looking at gender. Just from reviewing the research literature and our own observations so far, we found that there is gendered impact at the household level, but this is generally true for households that don't have access to a private latrine. Once a household has access to a private latrine, we haven't, and please give me feedback if you find this to be incorrect, we haven't found so much of gendered impacts at the household level, but we suspect that there's going to be a lot of gendered impacts at work and at school. And so this is another aspect that we're trying to track. We don't currently plan on incorporating this into a modified SFD, but if we are looking at equity overall, we think it's important to also try and track these gendered impacts. So now I want to just go through some pictures, which will give you some qualitative idea of what we're trying to track through our quantitative survey. Again, since we don't have outcomes as of yet, I'm not able to give you those quantities, but it'll give you some idea of hopefully eventually what we are trying to get at. So here what you can see is some illicit dumping of septage. This is in, I believe this is in Bangalore. They're just dumping directly into one of the mainline underground drains. And you can see some of these local schoolgirls checking out what's happening. So this is just to convey that this illicit dumping is happening. And it's happening at a rate of very roughly, it's hard to track this, so I don't have very hard numbers. But based on some work that a collaborator of mine has done, dissertation, he estimates that roughly 2/3 of all fecal sludge in Bangalore and 1/3 in Hubli is illicitly dumped into the environment. So when it's dumped, you have to think about who is in that area. So you might be thinking about these schoolgirls. Another example of illicit dumping, you also might be thinking about the workers themselves. So he did a lot of extensive field observations looking at riding around in these trucks, learning about some of the challenges and the practices of the people operating these collection services. And he found that in general, the workers that are operating the hoses and the vacuums and are really on the ground and they're doing these things, oftentimes, pretty much across the board, they're coming from Dalit castes. They don't have any training and they don't use any protective gear. The truck drivers themselves are separate. They're not always from Dalit castes. In general, they're not. In addition, the truck owners are also not. So there's this division that's happening. Okay. Another thing that I think sometimes gets missed in a lot of the policy talk about fecal sludge management is gray water management. So these are not sewer pipes, these are gray water pipes, and they're collecting all of the gray water of this apartment building in the back and then disposing it into the open drain right next to where this woman collects her drinking water. So I think that it's important when we're talking about inequity in the sanitation system, even if we have upgrades such as fecal sludge management, there are still these exposures that are happening for, I would say, a certain segment of the population. Likewise, if we have upgrades putting in larger drains, that also might create exposure routes for certain segments of the population. Here you can see this large open drain filled with solid waste. I think it's safe to assume that when heavy rains are coming, more solid waste is going to be deposited into this drain. And once flood levels reach up to some of these pipes, the people that are accessing their drinking water through these, if you can see these pipes going across the drain, are going to have their drinking water access, their drinking water quality heavily impacted. So I think when we're talking about sanitation system upgrades, we need to be thinking about some of these exposure routes and tracking them as well. So this is probably an easy one, but I'll throw it out to you since I've been talking at you this whole time. I'll throw it out to you and ask, does anyone know what she's pointing at? Can you guess? Rahul? Exactly. So this is the level of flooding that comes into her house. This is in Hubli Dharwad. And this is her house. So you can see that there's this open drain in front of her house. This is probably not something new for everyone in this room, but there's a few hidden, I think there's a few hidden things that are important to point out here that illustrate what we're trying to get at really well. So you can see, yeah, okay. So you can see here that there's this open drain that's just covered by these loose stone planks. I don't know if you can also see, here I'm just going to have to leave the microphone. Can everyone hear me? Yeah? Okay. I don't know if you can also see here, there's this low stone slab, which they put across, I think it's actually cement slab, that they put across their doorway. This is to try and block some of the flood water when it comes in. So you can automatically see that they have regular flooding at least up to this level, since they put this in. You can also see here is their drinking water access up at this level. What you might not have noticed, I'm sure you've noticed this apartment building right next door. What you might not have noticed, way off in the corner here, is the drain that's been put in front of this apartment building. So if you look at how high this drain is, and what the maximum flood level is for this drain, so even if the waters come up to this level, the people in this apartment building are protected. So once this drain went in, this apartment building definitely benefited. But automatically, whenever there's heavy rainfall, and it reaches this maximum flood level, if you could draw this line from this maximum level for this drain across, you can see that it's going to go into her house up to the level that she pointed. And it's also going to impact her drinking water. So the idea embedded in this picture is that here you have an upgrade. Here you have some sort of benefit. But whenever you're tracking this beneficial impact, this upgrade, it's important to also look at who is negatively impacted. And I think sanitation systems in particular, with sanitation systems in particular, it's important to track both at the same time. So this is the ultimate goal that we're trying to get at with this modified SFP. Again, we're still thinking about how best to do that. I'm not sure if we hit at the best way, but hopefully this gives you an idea of what we're trying to do. So now I want to move on to another project. It's in the same location, but it has a different goal. Again, looking at non-sewered sanitation systems and the sanitation service chain, and breaking down the sanitation service chain into on-site sanitation and fecal sludge management. Again, I'll skip through this fairly quickly since I think everyone's familiar with what fecal sludge is, and also familiar with this separation between on-site sanitation and fecal sludge management. The idea behind this project is looking at septage as a resource, and whether or not that's right for India. So certainly it's considered a resource in many countries around the world. This is already being implemented, and I'll give some examples of that. This picture was taken in Ghana. And so in Ghana, I think people are probably familiar with a lot of projects that are happening there, treating septage as a resource. Certainly, a lack of sewage treatment is a big issue in India, in larger cities, but even more in smaller cities. One solution is to construct sewers and large wastewater treatment plants, but sewers and wastewater treatment plants are expensive to operate and maintain, and solutions are needed now. So this is sort of the impetus for better fecal sludge management. And again, I would say my perspective is that certainly sewers and centralized treatment are part of the solution. The real question is figuring out where and when. So septage can be turned into charcoal, or excreta can be turned into charcoal or fertilizer, and septage can be turned into natural gas, solid fuel that can be sold to the industrial sector. Water can be reused for irrigation. It can also be turned into fertilizer as well as chicken feed. Just some examples of excreta being turned into soil amendment. These are all container-based sanitation examples, so probably not the right solution for India, but still examples of projects on the ground that are treating waste as a resource. In California, East Bay Mud is producing so much electricity from their anaerobic digesters that they're able to run their entire treatment plant and then have a surplus that they sell back to the grid, producing a subsidy that they then distribute to all of their customers. And then unfortunately, the Pivot pilot project in Kigali was recently ended, but I thought that was an interesting example since they were producing a solid fuel which could then be sold to the cement industry. Now, with all of these examples, the revenue generated is not sufficient to cover all of the costs of the system, but it is at least a partial subsidy that I think is useful in resource-constrained environments. So in the context of India, we wanted to look at what is the willingness to pay for improved on-site sanitation. And by improved, we mean septic tanks that protect the groundwater, but we also mean treatment of septage, reuse of septage, and protections for sanitation workers. Protective equipment, the use of protective equipment for sanitation workers. We also wanted to look at how much people were willing to pay for STPs as well, and whether or not they valued not just treatment, but reuse in the context of STPs. We have some data already collected in the context of Aleppi, and we're hoping to also collect similar data in Hubli Dharwad as well. In Aleppi, this is a population of 50,000. There's no sewer network. They do have, I think probably people are aware, they have extensive canals, which are their main tourist attraction. But the canals are pretty heavily polluted with organic contaminants and fecal waste. One of the major sources of pollution, not the only one, but one of the sources of pollution is on-site sanitation. Many of the households there don't have septic tanks. Instead, they have soak pits, so they have open bottoms, contaminating the groundwater and then leading to contamination in the canals as well. So one of the solutions, at least for this source of contamination, is upgrading the on-site containment to make sure that everyone has a proper septic tank. In addition, with this project, we wanted to look at whether or not people valued fecal sludge treatment. So fecal sludge treatment requires some sort of a willingness to pay for the ongoing operation and maintenance of the fecal sludge treatment plant itself. That's not what we're looking at here. What we're looking at here instead is if if the ULB could provide some sort of a subsidy for upgrading on-site sanitation systems, how much more would people be willing to pay for their upgraded on-site sanitation systems if, as a part of that larger project, the ULB was also putting in proper treatment for their septage? So the idea is linking these two and seeing whether or not people are more engaged to upgrade their own systems if the ULB is upgrading theirs. We did this through a discrete choice model. This is a stated preference where we had several different attributes. Those attributes varied between two hypothetical situations. Each hypothetical situation had a price associated with it. So then we presented each of these two hypothetical situations to households with the associated price and asked them, which one do you prefer? We did this several hundred times. And then we can plug this data into this discrete choice statistical model in order to estimate people's willingness to pay for each of these different attributes, as well as segregating people's willingness to pay based on household characteristics. So this is still preliminary results. This is an ongoing analysis. But right now, we were looking at the characteristics of gender, house ownership, built area, well water use, and then the age of the septic tank. But we're planning on looking at others as well. I just want to present to you the basic model right now. And we found statistically significant results for a preference for low probability of groundwater contamination. We also found statistically significant results for treatment and reuse of fecal sludge. We did not find statistically significant results for a lower land requirement. This is the on-site sanitation system itself. Or for prefabrication, or even for longer emptying frequency. So it was interesting that people did have preferences for these groundwater contamination, reuse, and treatment, and not for the other attributes that we included. No, price does have a statistically significant result. So we use that price in order to calculate willingness to pay. So then, using these three attributes plus the attribute of price, we calculated that people are willing to pay, on average, roughly 16,000 rupees for improved on-site sanitation systems that protected groundwater, that at least had a lower probability of groundwater contamination. We found these additional estimates, 19,900 for fecal sludge treatment and then 8,000 for fecal sludge reuse. But we also had, we interviewed 3 local contractors. That's the most that we could find, unfortunately. But at least from those local contractors, we found that the average cost of putting in a sound septic tank was around 45,000 rupees, indicating that although there was a positive willingness to pay, it was not sufficient to cover the full price of this upgraded sanitation system. Now, what we would argue, how we would interpret that, is some sort of subsidy should be provided. Where would this subsidy come from? We would argue, possibly, and I would like to get your feedback on this interpretation of the results.
Ask a clarificatory question.
Yes, of course.
Just for, when you say fecal sludge is reused, the households who are giving this information, they are, households which also have a little bit of, homestead agriculture or kitchen gardening or something, and they are assuming they'll use the fecal sludge on site, or that farmers, away from them will be using the fecal sludge?
No. That farmers away from them would be using the fecal sludge. Yes. So we would make the argument that whatever subsidy might be available, whatever government grants are available or government loans that are available for sewers and centralized treatment, Instead, those could be directed towards subsidy of upgrading on-site sanitation systems. Likewise, if there's any revenue that's collected from reuse of the septage, this could also be directed towards the treatment plant or the upgrade to on-site sanitation systems. So we're also looking at willingness to pay in Hubli Dharwad. We've previously done a willingness to pay study for fecal sludge reuse. So this was conducted among farmers as well as farm workers. Again, this was part of the dissertation work from my collaborator. He's recently joined the faculty at Azim Premji University. And he's found that, oh, sorry, just a moment. So we previously did this willingness to pay study for farmers as well as farm workers. Our current study in Hubli Dharwad is also looking at willingness to pay among households for worker protections, fecal sludge treatment, and reuse. Currently, reuse is happening, as I've mentioned earlier. Around 2/3 of all septage is being reused in agricultural, in farms around Hubli Dharwad. But right now, whatever treatment that is happening, this is generally just drying, is inadequate.
These are households outside of part of households who are emptying the disposal?
So,
Any household is paying for?
yeah, sorry, I should have had a more detailed explanation of what we're looking at in Hubli Dharwad right now. So in the past, we were looking at farmers and farm workers. Right now, we're looking at households. Some households in Hubli Dharwad have on-site sanitation. Some households have access to the sewer network. So they have access to some sort of UGD. The willingness to pay study that we're doing has 3 different components. One is willingness to pay for upgraded on-site sanitation. That's being conducted only with households that currently have on-site sanitation, or with households that don't have any access to sanitation. We're also looking at willingness to pay for improved collection of septage, and that again is only among households that currently have on-site sanitation or don't have access to any sanitation or any private sanitation. The third component is looking at willingness to pay for wastewater treatment at the municipal level, and that is being conducted only among households that currently have access to the underground the sewer network. Yes, so did I answer your question? What was your question again? Mm-hmm.
So the households that have a high willingness to pay for worker protections,
Mm-hmm.
are they the same households who are involved in that work? Or is it all households
Mm-hmm.
that were interviewed who are also willing, in addition to willingness to pay for fecal sludge treatment and reuse, are also out of the goodness of their heart willing to pay for workers not belonging to their households
Mm-hmm.
for protection?
So the willingness to pay study that we're doing in Hubli Dharwad has a very similar setup to the willingness to pay study which was already conducted in Aleppi, where we present 2 hypothetical scenarios with this list of attributes, and the attributes that we've included are worker protections as well as treatment and reuse. So we're able to estimate people's willingness to pay for each of these attributes separately, and have included all of those attributes in the data that we've collected from all households. So as I mentioned earlier, in the study that was already completed, farm owners have a high willingness to pay for fecal sludge, and farm workers don't use protective gear, often handling inadequately treated fecal sludge, as you can see here. In addition, we've already found from analyzing the data that in particular, one of the attributes that we included in that willingness to pay study is preferences for labeling. So whether or not they prefer the label just say organic manure, or if it should say fecal sludge derived organic manure. And we found that farm owners had a preference for it to just say organic manure. Among farm workers, we found that vegetarians preferred that it have the full label of fecal sludge derived organic manure. Non-vegetarians preferred that it just say organic manure. So again, this is an interesting result. We're still figuring out how to interpret this, but among this same population, this is not a surprise, but we just had to verify, we found that there is a continuation of caste social restrictions based on kitchen entry, marriage, and land sales. And so we bring up this data just to indicate that there is the possibility that fecal sludge reuse could reinforce social exclusions based on caste. And I think this is a really important complication that needs to be discussed whenever we talk about reuse. And I don't have a solution to it. I'm not sure if I would say this means that fecal sludge reuse should or shouldn't happen. It's just to say that fecal sludge reuse is already happening, and does have potential environmental benefits. So I think that it should be considered and dealt with and researched, but at the same time, these sorts of complications need to be tracked and addressed as well. In addition, we are right now trying to set up a collaboration with CDD, again, as well with Azim Premji University. With this project, this is just starting. I think CDD has some pretty good costing data on specifically for systems that have sewers and centralized treatment, as well as systems that consist of on-site sanitation and fecal sludge management, and also separately systems that have decentralized wastewater treatment. So I haven't looked at that data yet, but the plan is to try and calculate what is the average cost for each of these different classes of sanitation systems, separately for total cost, capital cost, as well as operations and maintenance. And then, if we can, try and figure out what are the major determinants of costs as well. So again, this is very preliminary, but I would love to get your feedback on this particular research project and how we're framing it. Let me skip that. So in conclusion, looking at sanitation access, we have the SDGs, which are a good start, but they're not enough. I've also presented a preliminary project on looking at inequity in the sanitation system. The goal of that is to track exposure as part of impact assessment. And looking at going towards more sustainable sanitation, first off, we're trying to look at what people are willing to pay for, and we're finding at least some positive willingness to pay for upgrades. But whether or not this is enough is uncertain. And we found through our observations that reuse is already happening in India, but it has unique complications which have yet to be resolved. Now, if anybody has any questions. I also forgot to mention that the work in Hubli Dharwad is a collaboration with GIZ as well. They've helped us out with some funding for that. So I didn't mention it in the presentation, but I want to mention that as well. So now if anybody has questions for this presentation, I'm all ears. And maybe after we discuss this presentation, I can also, if there's time left, put up a few slides for the continuous water project as well.